Welcome to Open on BronxNet. I'm your host, Sonyi Lopez, inviting you to follow us on social media at BronxNet TV on Instagram and Twitter, and BronxNet Community Television on Facebook. The U.S. state of New York recently enacted two groundbreaking pieces of legislation. One law limits the practice of solitary confinement, and the other legalizes marijuana. One assembly member from the Bronx shared some comments in Albany after voting for the MRTA marijuana law. Let's check this clip out.
That's what we're voting on today. Equity. Economic and social equity for all New Yorkers. So regardless of what you call it, marijuana, cannabis, weed, pot, bud, grass, dank, sour, kush, chronic, ganja, reefer, haze, or zaza. I could go on all day. But regardless of what you call it, after today, we'll call it legal.
I thought that speech was really iconic. So joining us now to discuss is Assembly Member of Assembly District 85, Kenny Burgos. Welcome, Assemblyman Burgos. As we say in the Bronx, that was mad funny. Zaza, let's shout out to CJ. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Sonyi. Yes, shout out to CJ. Although he's from Staten Island, I'm going to say the Bronx has adopted the term Zaza and has made it our own.
We definitely have, and we'll take him in. Welcome to the Bronx, CJ. We'll take you in.
We'll take it.
On to the serious stuff. So now about this Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act, aka the MRTA, can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, so the MRTA is essentially, it's a historic bill the legislature passed. This is legalizing adult use recreational marijuana for adults to age over 21, and it really just aims to end the decades-long prohibition of marijuana that we've had in New York. This also aims to create a new office of cannabis management. This is to be the regulation of cultivating, growing, sales, and distribution of marijuana. The bill also works to get the framework for tax structure so we can bring in significant revenue here in New York to really aim towards our most needed social services. And then I think at the heart of it, the bill is just to address racial and economic justice that our communities have just been impacted for decades with the prohibition of marijuana. So that's the main focus of this bill.
Right. Thank you so much for breaking them down, Assembly Member. And I'm glad you bring that up because for far too long, the Bronx has been disproportionately affected by the criminalization of marijuana. Can you break down how exactly this bill seeks to support the community through reinvestment and equity?
Yeah. So, I mean, we know New York's existing marijuana policies before this bill have just really failed to protect the welfare of our communities. These policies have put thousands of New Yorkers into the criminal justice system for really nonviolent offenses and really denies people the fundamental right to vote, access to housing, student loans, and just a ton of vital services to be just working members of our community. So in the past 2 decades, New York has become really the marijuana arrest capital of the country. Over 800,000 arrests and summonses dealing with marijuana. But unfortunately, that has been completely disproportionate, especially when you talk about communities like the Bronx. In New York City, African Americans are arrested for low-level marijuana offenses at 8 times the rate of their white counterparts. Hispanic and Latino communities are arrested 5 times the rate of their white counterparts. And now we know just through our own, life and also statistically that Americans use marijuana at pretty much the same rates. So it's proven that these policies have just unfortunately targeted our communities here in the Bronx. So this bill is really just aiming to reverse these kinds of policies and repair the communities with the tax revenue that we collect.
Good to hear. And how else is cannabis tax revenue being distributed through the tax exactly?
So the Marijuana Regulation and Taxation Act is aimed it's estimated to collect about $350 million a year, and I think probably on the lowest end. You have some estimates that bring it at about $500 million to almost $1 billion a year in terms of tax revenue. So all the revenue raised from marijuana sales would go into a dedicated cannabis revenue fund, and this would be targeted to cover training for law enforcement to detect drivers that are high. It has 20% dedication to treatment and public education, 40% to the state lottery fund for public education, and 40% to a fund that makes grants for social equity, including job placement programs. So we were very, very strategic in crafting this bill to make sure the revenue we collect is highly targeted and highly purposeful.
Okay. And in simple terms, people may be wondering, tuning into the show, does the MRTA essentially mean that Bronxites can smoke and carry marijuana without fear of being arrested?
Simply put, yes. Marijuana is now currently legal in New York State, although the regulation framework and you won't see dispensary sales for about 18 months or so. Right now, it is illegal to possess up to 3 ounces of marijuana, and you're able to smoke marijuana, although there are still just simple regulations similar to smoking or drinking alcohol, correct, right? So where you can't smoke cigarettes in public spaces, in a bar or restaurant, on planes, things like that, you cannot smoke marijuana in those places either. Comfort of your home is obviously safe, assuming your landlord doesn't have a no smoking policy. And obviously, it is still illegal to drive while impaired, which would mean driving while high.
Thank you for breaking that down as well. Assemblymember Burgos, you and your colleagues also recently voted on a now passed historical law ending solitary confinement. It's called the hashtag Halt Solitary Law. Can you tell us more about this law?
Yeah, I mean, this was an absolutely huge bill. Advocates have been fighting for this for so many years. It's been held up because we've had a Republican state Senate. But thankfully, we've reached a point where there's been support, we got the votes, and we were able to pass this legislation. So HALT actually stands for the Humane Alternatives to Long-Term Solitary Confinement Act. And this bill really just limits the time an inmate can spend in segregated confinement. So this ends the segregated confinement of vulnerable people, restrict the criteria that can result in this kind of confinement, and just create a more humane and effective alternative to these kinds of confinements.
And when we talk about that, we think about tragedies of Bronxites and Rikers, specifically Khalif Browder and Leilin Polanco, among many others. Solitary played a huge role in their deaths. How would this law seek to rectify current long-held inhumane practices on Rikers Island in particular?
Yeah, I mean, those were horrible tragedies that we heard of our neighbors, right? I mean, when you talk about Leilin Polanco, who lost her life in solitary confinement on Rikers Island. We talk about Khalif Browder, who unfortunately took his life after spending months and almost years in solitary confinement. It really speaks to the torturous conditions that solitary confinement is. I mean, these are conditions that we wouldn't subject our pets to. And we do this to our neighbors, to our brothers and sisters. People who are involved in the criminal justice system who should be seeking rehabilitation and not a punitive structure. So the Halt Solitary Confinement Bill it puts a 15-day restriction on an individual, on how long an individual can be in solitary confinement, but it also has a special population carve-out that are not allowed to be in solitary confinement at all. And those carve-outs are individuals aged under 21, which would have addressed Khalif Browder, unfortunately, individuals aged over 55, individuals with a disability, and any individual who's pregnant or up to 8 weeks postpartum or caring for children in a facility. So we're really just honing in. I would have loved to see, the outright abolishment of solitary confinement, but we're working towards a framework where our prisons and jails really just are rehabilitative and not punitive.
Can you also tell us about the solutions set in place in the Halt Solitary Law, like the residential rehabilitation units to provide incarcerated individuals with therapeutic and trauma-informed programming?
Yes, so like I said, we're aiming to make these systems more rehabilitative and just not punitive. Do we want systems where people are in this endless cycle of criminal justice, or we want them rehabilitated and make them active members of our community? So things like the RRUs really aim to do that, right? So we mandate there's additional out-of-cell time for individuals that are put into these rehabilitative units after the 15-day limit has been reached. We prohibit denial of services, treatment, basic needs like clothing, food, bedding, where an individual is held in segregated confinement. And we also require the Department of Corrections to publish monthly reports on its website with semi-annual and annual reports of the total number of people who are in these segregated confinements.
Got it. And what are your hopes for your constituents and Bronxites as a whole with the passing of these two historical laws, Assemblymember?
Yeah, I mean, my hope being here as an elected member, for the Bronx and as we work in the state legislature is really to restore justice to our communities. It's not lost on us that there's been decades of prohibition, there's been decades of targeting to communities like ours. So it's really our duty and our job to reimagine how we frame our society, how we establish these laws, and who are they helping, who are they hurting, and to make for a more just, more equitable, and just a more fair system for everyone to live in.
Right. Finally, before we go, how can people stay in touch with you and your office?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook. They're all under @Kenny Burgos NY, which you can see on your screen. My office is located in Manor Avenue, 1163 in the Soundview area, and you can call my office at 718-893-0202.
Thank you so much for joining us today and share more on these two historical laws, Assemblymember Burgos.
Thanks so much, Sonyi.
Kenny Burgos is the Assembly member of Assembly District 85 here in the Bronx. We'll be right back here on Open Tuesday.